This is a story about a boy who had a problem and a man who listened. It started 95 years ago in a little town in Iowa, in their new candy and ice cream shop. A boy came in and said, "I want some ice cream." And then he saw the display of chocolate bars. He goes, "No, no, no, no. I'll have that. Oh, you have that flavor of. Oh." The man behind the counter got a little impatient and said, "Why don't you just buy both?" And the boy looked up at him and said, "I only got one nickel. I'll take a chocolate bar." And he plunked down his nickel and picked up his chocolate bar and left. But the man in that candy store couldn't get that boy out of his mind. He kept on thinking, why couldn't have he had both for a nickel? Chocolate-covered ice cream. This man's name was Chris Nelson. This was actually his second job. His day job was as a Latin teacher in the local high school. And when the people in the town found out that their Latin teacher was going to open a candy and ice cream store and planned to sell ice cream during the winter time, they thought he was crazy. Well, once he got this idea in his mind of trying to get chocolate to stick to ice cream, they knew he was crazy because the recipe he had for chocolate icing didn't stick. Maybe you've made a chocolate fudge sundae one at some time, and you pour the chocolate fudge on, and it just slithers off to the bottom of the bowl. That was his problem. So every woman he met, he said, "Could you give me your recipe for chocolate icing?" And and he tried all the recipes, and they all slithered off the ice cream. Finally, one day, when a salesman came in and he was selling chocolate-covered nuts, Chris asked him, "Do you know how your company gets the chocolate to stick to the nuts?" And the salesman said, "Sure. First we cover the nuts with cocoa butter, and then we cover them with chocolate, because the chocolate will stick to the cocoa butter, and the cocoa butter will stick to the nuts." That solved his problem. So he made a trial run of 250 I-Scream bars. It was during the summer, so people weren't going to think this was another one of his crazy ideas. He took them to a fireman's picnic, and if you will excuse the expression, they sold like hotcakes. He knew he had a good idea, so he wrote a patent for it. And then he wanted to find a partner who would do the manufacturing, because he was a Latin teacher, he had the shop, he didn't want to go whole hog and go into the manufacturing of it himself. 7 dairies turned him down. Finally, he had to travel to nearby Omaha, Nebraska, where he spoke to the head of the processing plant for dairy, who immediately said, "That's a wonderful idea. I want to be your partner, not as a part of this company, but let's start our own." And they sat down and wrote a handwritten agreement. I held that agreement in my hand. Well, I was researching this in the Smithsonian, and so my hands were in issued cotton gloves, and the agreement was encased in plastic. But between my fingers, there was the agreement that Chris Nelson and Russell Stover signed. Yes, that Russell Stover, yes. Now, Russell said to Chris, "I really don't like that name, I-Scream. I think that's confusing, and it won't make our product stand out." So he sent his kid sister to the library to come back with a list of words all dealing with cold. And one of the words on that list was Eskimo. And the two gentlemen said, Eskimo, Eskimo, Eskimo pie. Yes, that's what we'll call it. So they then, the patent was issued. Then they started selling licensing agreements. They sold 2,700 licensing agreements across the country. And pretty soon, 1 million Eskimo pies were being sold a day. This was 1922. And these gentlemen each got a little bit of money for each of those Eskimo pies. They were getting $2,000 each a week. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind just getting $2,000 a week now. But back then in 1922, most people made $2,000 a year. This was fabulous amounts of money. Now, in this archival box at the Smithsonian, there was a contemporary newspaper article. And one of the questions the reporter asked, Mr. Nelson, what have you been doing with all this money you've been receiving? And he said, well, one thing that's in the plans is to bring my grandmother over from Denmark. I was born in this country, but I'm named after her, and I've always enjoyed reading her letters. So she's 80 years old, and she's going to come over soon, and I look forward to meeting her. And then he said, I've done something else that probably anyone would have done who's been laughed at by most of the people in the town they live in. I bought the biggest, fanciest car I could, and I slowly drove up and down the streets of my town waving.
Great.
Now,
Great.
This sounds like, oh, their world was made. Well, no. There were patent infringements. The patent was revoked because one of their competitors said, no, we're not infringing on their patent. That's something that anyone who was skilled in the art, which is patent lingo, would have known that you needed cocoa butter between the substance, nuts or ice cream, and the chocolate. Russell Stover just got disgusted by the whole thing, and his legal bill was so large, he just turned over all of his rights, whatever they were worth, to pay for his legal bills. He and his wife moved to Denver, Colorado, and started the Russell Stover business, which still exists today. Chris Nelson, he hung on for a little while longer, but then he sold the business to the Reynolds Aluminum Company. Now, that might seem an odd a decision that the aluminum company made, except they were quite familiar with Eskimo pies because each one of them was wrapped in a piece of Reynolds aluminum foil. So Chris Nelson kept on working for them. One of his first inventions while being an employee of theirs was a thermos jug that was rectangular in shape, the same shape as the Eskimo pies. This was, after all, 1922, and most people didn't have an electric refrigerator, let alone an electric freezer. They had ice boxes. So, but by having this thermos, this custom-made thermos, people who ran newsstands on the street, they could go to a place that had an electric freezer, fill it up, and sell Eskimo pies on the street. The sales of Eskimo pies just increased. Even when he was in his early 60s, Chris Nelson invented a new machine to manufacture Eskimo pies. And again, in this box, I loved that box, there was a letter he had written to the head of Reynolds Aluminum Foil when Chris Nelson was 83, 17 years after he retired. And it said, I had a wonderful frozen chocolate mousse dessert at my favorite restaurant. And it made me think that perhaps that's a new product that you could offer. And I bought a number of them, and I've brought them home to my kitchen, and I've been experimenting with them, and he gave some details. So he still had that inventor's spark at age 83. Speaking of aging
gracefully.
Yes. Now, in this box at the Smithsonian, there was an official brochure from the, I think it was a yearly report from the Reynolds Aluminum Company, and there was an article on Chris Nelson. And it said, our inventor of Eskimo pies, Chris Nelson, eats an Eskimo pie every day. Now, I've dealt a tiny bit with marketing departments, and I know that they might exaggerate now and then. It just didn't, I'm sorry, even if you really love your product, I can't imagine eating it every single day. But I imagine he had an Eskimo pie more frequently than most people. And it got me to thinking. I wondered, whenever he did eat an Eskimo pie, I wonder if how often he remembered that boy with a problem, the boy he listened to and changed his life. Story of Chris Nelson, the inventor of Eskimo pies.